Noah's Ark has been rediscovered in the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat. It is located between 3,900 and 4,700 meters above sea level, 4 to 11 meters under the surface of the gorge. It is 158 meters in length. It has all the prerequisites and criteria of a maritime barge. The angled hulls slope inward toward the central keel. Barnacles are found on the exterior of the hull. There's evidence for mortise and tenon joinery or coke and dowel joinery. Much evidence for cross beams at all elevations of the walls to unite and stabilize the hull. There's thousands of cages within the structure, and all of them filled with non-skeletal animal byproduct, everything from feces to feathers, fur, hair, exoskeleton, and discarded skins, scutes. Thousands of animal tracks of every type of animal, from mammals to avian remains, birds, reptiles, insects, and amphibians. It's truly a very remarkable site. The site also correlates wonderfully with all the descriptions in Genesis, chapters 5 through 10, and also in the Quran by the Islamic prophet Muhammad. Also descriptions of Berosus and Josephus, the Roman Jewish historian, as well as the criteria that it's in the middle of an expanse of water, which occurs during the summer, as told by one of the accounts associated with Alexander the Great. So last time we talked about a very depressing, tragic scenario where the population in Armenia underwent genocide by the Turks during World War I, 1915 and 1916, and then also the Turkish War of Independence. From 1930 to 1938, the Armenian Catholicos, the office of the Catholicos, was purged, and hundreds of lay people, priests, especially those associated with Catholicos, the Catholicos himself, Koran I, and also the chair of the archaeology department at Yerevan, were purged, tortured, and then killed. And the reason is that they all knew something about Noah's Ark. And this was very dangerous to the Marxist-Leninist state and was a fourfold problem. Number one, Noah's Ark threatened Marxist-Leninist theory that every civilization emerged from very simple, primitive, communal societies. In this case, it was a total rejection of that premise, because civilization with Noah's Ark emerged from a very technologically advanced and sophisticated barge from the last part of the Stone Age, 13,100 to 9,600 BC. This site is also the progenitor for the Neolithic period. Also, Noah's Ark really brought into question the whole idea of the Soviets doing away with nationalist identities. The Soviet state wanted to implement a province that was free from national identities, and Noah's Ark was a problem because it reinforced the idea that the Armenians were special. They were special in that they were the chosen people to protect and conceal the Ark. Also, Noah's Ark threatened the whole idea, the whole premise of Marxist-Leninism, that the religious tomes of the Bible and the Quran were entirely false, just a made-up collection of fables used to provide an opiate for the masses. In this case, Noah's Ark showed the Old Testament, and at least parts of it, the Quran, were absolutely correct in that there was a 158-meter barge in the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat. And the last very serious threat posed by Noah's Ark was that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, that had just founded the new Republic of Turkey, would be able to use Noah's Ark as a method to unify the Ummah al-Islam, the Muslim peoples, right there on the border of the Soviet Union. And this was a tremendous threat to Joseph Stalin, Lavrenti Beria, and the soon-to-be liquidated Nikolai Yezhov. So in the midst of the tragedy, we have the former guides and their families that led prominent Americans and Tsarist Russians to Noah's Ark. They are now with the artifacts in what is now the Republic of Georgia. But here is the other thin line of knowledge that survived both the genocide and the purge. Several women in 1915 traveled from the Republic of Georgia to try to assist their relatives to escape either to Eastern Armenia, namely Yerevan, or to escape into the Kingdom of Georgia to avoid the genocide that was initiated by the Ottoman Turks and then the Turkish Republic during the Turkish War of Independence. Now, one woman in particular went back to eastern Turkey in the area of Doğubayazıt, near the base of Greater Mount Ararat, to find these relatives. Unfortunately, these relatives had already been captured by the Turks, and they were never heard from again. They joined the long lines of marchers that were marched, if they made it, to the deserts in northern Syria. This particular woman was very terrified because she knew if the Turks, either the Turkish police or the military, would have captured her, she would have been also on this death march to northern Syria. The Kurdish populations and the Armenians knew of each other, and she knew this young gentleman. She thought he was attractive, and he was attracted to her. But back then, especially at the beginning of the 1900s, it's not like the West, where you can go to a bar or you can go to a club and you can meet someone of a different nationality. That was not the case in Eastern Turkey or Western Armenia. Here, the families tightly controlled who you could see, who you could meet, and who you could marry. And the Armenians had their own schools and their own kinship structures and their own prospects for marriage, as did the Kurds. But the Kurdish communities were more open to marriages outside the Kurdish populations or the kinship structures. For the smaller families, there was more ability to marry outside the family. And one family in particular, this individual, saw that this woman was in trouble, and if she had continued to be there, she would have been captured by the Turks and then led to her death. But what he did is he said, listen, I will protect you and I will marry you, but what you need to do is you need to convert to Islam and you need to be my wife and live with my family. And the woman agreed. She had a situation where she could either be killed, be marched to the deserts in northern Syria, or die along the way, or accept this man's proposal. And she was attracted to him, and she was grateful that he saved her life. Now, it should be stated that these Armenian women that married into Kurdish families, it was extremely rare. Because during this period, there was a time of intense starvation, as there was not only the Armenian Genocide, but then also the Russian counterattacks with Armenian militia during the Caucasus campaign later in World War I from 1914 through 1918. But it was extremely rare and really an act of love and mercy that these Kurdish men married these Armenian women during this terrible time of starvation and strife. Now, the man said to his new bride that she had to stay in the house and eventually take care of their young children. Modern women would think, well, that's terrible that she was trapped inside the house. Well, the alternative was death. If other Kurdish militia or Turkish regular army discovered her, she would be added to the individuals that were marched to the Syrian desert and probably raped and killed along the way. So it was a life and death situation. But Having this woman marry this Kurdish man and become a Muslim, it afforded her 4 lines of protection. The first, that she was a Muslim, and so it was less likely that she would be tortured and killed. Another layer of protection was her husband. Now, many of the Kurdish men were armed, and they were part of the Kurdish militia that assisted Turkish forces, or then retired and laid low once the Russians advanced with the Armenians during the Caucasus campaign from 1914 to 1918 during World War I. The third line of protection she had was that her Kurdish husband belonged to a clan or a kinship structure. And this kinship structure also protected. So it's kind of like we don't have a lot of that in America today. But kinship structures were, in Kurdish communities, were larger clans, similar to what we've heard about like the Hatfields or McCoys. Larger extended families that were used to protect each other. So if you attacked a particular individual, a man and his wife, the clan would come and help. So all the cousins, all the brothers, and all the interrelated members of the family would come to their defense. So this woman had 3 levels of protection. Number 1, she was a Muslim convert. Number 2, her husband protected her and he was armed. Number 3, the clan to which her husband belonged would protect her. And the last line of defense were the Caucasian shepherd dogs. These are vicious, terrible, or in her case, wonderful protectors. And what they did is they applied collars of spikes around these dogs that grew. They're very large and they're very vicious and they're very protective. And so she had 4 lines of defense. And what did she do during this time? She learned how to speak Kurdish and Turkish fluently without an accent. Because if she betrayed an accent and someone discovered that she was indeed Armenian, this would increase her likelihood that she would be killed. So talk about a very tense situation. And moreover, this is during a time of intense starvation, intense strife. Her husband was involved in pastoralism, light farming, and also transport of goods across borders. Some would say smuggling, others would say international trade, because they're right there on the border with Iran, Iraq, and Georgia. So this area is an area of trade. Now, the wife and the husband helped each other. From 1914 to 1918, there was the Caucasus campaigns where Russia and Armenians, in revenge for the Armenian Genocide, attacked along a broad line, basically throughout eastern Turkey, and advanced west against Turkish regular army and Kurdish militia. And during this time, the wife interceded for her family, because as the Russian army advanced with the Dashnaq, she came to their defense and said that she was Armenian, that she had married her husband, and that her husband was a good guy and he wasn't involved in anti-Russian or anti-Armenian activities. And so as Russia and Armenian militia took over that area, she was able to protect her family by saying that she was Armenian. Now, did the Russian and the Armenian forces really like the fact that she had converted? No, they did not. However, the fact that she was Armenian and that her husband saved her from the Armenian Genocide prevented the family from being overwhelmed and accosted by Russian and Armenian forces during the Caucasus campaign. Now, conversely, from 1923 to 1934, there was the Kurdish deportations, where the Turkish regular forces moved in, and to quell Kurdish revolts, they moved a lot of Kurdish families to the interior of Turkey. And it was at this time that the husband intervened for his family and adopted assimilation by the Turkish government. And what he became was a minor role in the growing municipality of Doğubayazıt and the surrounding region. And what he was involved with was utilities. So he became a small but vital functionary role in the Turkish government of Doğubayazıt. And this way, their family was not deported into the interior. Now, there was another family that was mentioned in involvement with Noah's Ark, and that's the Abas-Abas family. The Abas-Abas family did not assimilate with the Turks, and to avoid deportation of their Kurdish family and clan into the interior of Turkey, they chose to migrate into northwestern Iran. These women gave the location of Noah's Ark to their spouses. And the location of Noah's Ark in the southern gorge became known. And sometimes there was archaeological context that these men found as they were scouting in areas of the southern gorge, and they would bring Westerners occasionally to them. But what was interesting is that not only did they know the location, the rough location of the site in the southern gorge, but they also knew the methods the Armenians' guides used, because these Armenian women were part of the family of the Armenian guides that led foreigners, principally Americans and Tsarist Russians, to Noah's Ark up until 1907. And what they told them was the methodology the Armenians used. Always take the individuals in fog or in a light snowstorm so they can't get their bearings. If they're strong individuals, take them from hamlet to hamlet around the mountain in a circuitous route so that they're tired and so that they're not fresh, so it would inhibit them from recognizing where these ark locations are. Another example was to take them at night or in the very early morning so they couldn't see their surroundings. Also, when they were at the ark, just let them worship at these little worship areas in the entrances of the ark several minutes, 15 minutes, so that the weather wouldn't clear up and they would know where they were, or where the ark was relative to Greater Mount Ararat. And this is what these Kurdish individuals did. And that's where eventually Ed Davis, he was an ark explorer who, no doubt, as you will see in the coming months, absolutely was at Noah's Ark. His recollection and his identification of Noah's Ark is absolutely spot on, and you're going to see that. But the Abas-Abas family had to migrate out because they were going to be involved in the Kurdish deportations by the Turks from 1923 to 1934. Another aspect of the Turkish government during the Kurdish deportations was that every Kurdish family had to adopt a family name or a last name, surname. And the husband chose, and his clan chose, the name Ertuğrul. And so before the Armenian Genocide, their Ibn, the name son, but their father, or they named themselves after a particular location. But in this case, he chose the surname or the family name Ertuğrul. So here, the husband and wife work together to preserve their family. The wife, during the Caucasus campaigns, because she was Armenian, spoke Armenian, and a little bit of Russian, was able to preserve her family, enable her Kurdish family to remain in the area of Doğubayazıt. And then the husband, by assimilating with the Turkish municipality, he was able to preserve his location and continue to stay in the Ararat region because he became a minor government employee in the city of Doğubayazıt. So both the husband and wife worked together. And during this time, the wife increasingly perfected her Kurdish, perfected her Turkish, so she could speak without an accent and not be identified as time progressed. During this time, as I mentioned previously, the wife told her husband the location of Noah's Ark, that she was part of the Armenian families that led foreigners, specifically prominent Americans, elite Armenians, and Tsarist Russians, to Noah's Ark. But when she told him the location of Noah's Ark in the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat, what did her husband do? He did very little. He was more interested in his government job and continuing to help his wife and his children and their overall clan, rather than climb the mountain and search for Noah's Ark. He simply was not interested. And this is very similar to many people today. The wonderful subscribers and viewers are very interested in Noah's Ark, and it's absolutely crucial in terms of science in the transition point between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, and between the Stone Age and the Farming Age. But many people are not interested, and certainly he was not interested, although he was respectful of his wife and respectful of her enthusiasm. Now, eventually, the husband and wife had children, and these children had two children, namely Mehmet Ertuğrul and Ahmet Ertuğrul. And Mehmet Ertuğrul continued. He was the third generation of Kurdish individuals that were involved in the municipality of Doğubayazıt. And eventually, because he was very political and very astute, he increased his promotions to become the deputy mayor of the city of Doğubayazıt. So again, this is three generations of the grandfather, the father, and eventually Mehmet Ertuğrul, that although they know the location of Noah's Ark in the southern gorge, did very little with this information. But it was the younger grandson, Ahmet Ertuğrul, when he was sitting at the foot of his grandmother, was absolutely fascinated with her accounts of being part of an Armenian family that led foreigners to Noah's Ark, specifically prominent Americans, elite Armenians, and influential Tsarist Russians before the Armenian Genocide. And his interest was very keen. And then he took concrete steps to find Noah's Ark. So only Ahmet Ertuğrul out of the entire family was interested in Noah's Ark, and his grandmother's revelation about the location of Noah's Ark in Southern Gorge, and that she was part of a collection of families that led individuals to Noah's Ark before 1907. In 1955, this Armenian woman was approached by Armenians, specifically from the Catholicos and Armenian intelligence. And one of the issues is that the Turks really didn't have a strong grasp of how fully this region had been infiltrated by Armenians. What the Armenians did is they looked for their long-lost relatives, and they looked at the marriage records to see if any of the names in these marriage records had an Armenian name or close to an Armenian name. Often these individuals disguise their names or rename themselves. There was another way that the Armenian intelligence determined Armenian women that had changed their name and married Kurdish men during the Armenian Genocide. What they did is during the Caucasus campaign, where Russia and Armenians advanced during and after the genocide that we discussed, they looked at all the birth records and they compared the birth records to marriage records that occurred in 1950 and soon thereafter in Kurdish family. And if they located a woman that suddenly appeared in a marriage record that did not have a corresponding birth record earlier than 1915, then they increased the focus because this woman was most likely an Armenian woman that married into a Kurdish family to survive the genocide. And they approached this woman. And they said, first of all, are you in sexual slavery? Are you being held against your will? Because we have the means to free you. We have the means, the ability to smuggle you to Yerevan or in the Oblast of Armenia or the Oblast of Georgia. By this time, the idea of the Trans-Caucasus Oblast had been passé, and they continued with these nationalities, especially since both Joseph Stalin and Lavrenti Beria were Georgian. And what she did is she declined their offer to be smuggled out because she loved her husband, he'd saved her life, and she had several children by him. So the second question they ask is, do you want to have the contact information for your relatives in what was then the Oblast of Georgia and what is now the Republic of Georgia? And she said yes, she would very much like to contact her old relatives to initiate conversation, to initiate introductions, that she had survived the genocide and was now happily married with several children. And that's what she did. They gave her the information of her relatives, and she began correspondence. And although this was scrutinized by Turkish and by Soviet intelligence, it wasn't a big deal to talk, but just conversations between families that had been separated. And so it was not a significant issue. Now, Ahmet Ertuğrul was very special. He was very bright. And what he was interested in was Noah's Ark, because he sat at the foot of his grandmother and learned about the reality of Noah's Ark, that it was on the Southern Gorge. But the Southern Gorge is quite extensive. So during the 1980s, he got the information about his Armenian relatives, and he contacted them, and he went to the Republic of Georgia just to meet them. And what was interesting, he was there to not only reconnect with his Armenian cousins, but he was also there to learn more specifics about the location of Noah's Ark. 3 things that he learned. Number 1, that the most pristine part of Noah's Ark was on the highest plateau. Number 2, that there were tunnels that led to the entrances to Noah's Ark, and these were defined by darker silt sand loam surrounded by the lighter glacial scree. To archaeologists, it looks very much like a post mold. And number 3, that Noah's Ark had fragmented and had been separated by the glacial ice and now extended over a far lengthier area, but it was all in the southern gorge. Now, after Ahmet Ertuğrul participated in his mandatory service, military service, where he was in food preparation, it was time for him to select a job. And the job that he selected, again with his focus on finding Noah's Ark, was he became part of DAKUT. And DAKUT is an organization's abbreviation for individuals that do mountain rescue. With this cover of DAKUT, he started investigating every crevice, every tunnel, every dark area surrounded by lighter glacial scree, and eventually found in sub-area A3 a portion of Noah's Ark, but here it was a ballast feature that had broken through Noah's Ark, and there was all these sandstone rocks and coral, which was very unlike the volcanic lithic material that is characteristic of Greater Mount Ararat. Now, what was interesting is that using his family connections, there was a clear difference between him and his Armenian cousins. First, his Armenian cousins were still under the direction of Crimean Hayreg, Papa Crimean, to mislead foreigners away from the location of Noah's Ark in the southern gorge. But here was the issue. Ahmet Ertuğrul was Armenian, but he was only a quarter Armenian from his grandmother. He was 3/4 Kurd, so he was not even though he knew the location and was able to examine all the different features and contexts in the southern gorge, he was not beholden to the final orders of Krimin Hayreg or Makirtich Krimin in terms of concealing the Ark or keeping it concealed from non-Armenians. In fact, Ertuğrul was principally non-Armenian. He was Kurdish. And so, with the cover of being involved with DAKUT, he could explore at his leisure every single area in the southern gorge. And what this led to is not only the discovery of a sub-area A3, but eventually he started discovering intact locations in Area B, which was the broken hull sections of the vessel. And then at this time, in the early 2000s, he met individuals from the Chinese church called TME. And from TME, he met individuals, namely Andrew Chiang, Wenman Fai, and told them that he had found Noah's Ark. But the problem is that he couldn't explore many of these tunnels without having additional help. He needed funds in order to explore these locations and dig through these tunnels to get through to the entrances to Noah's Ark that were 4 to 11 meters under ground in the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat. Well, in 2007, Ahmet Ertuğrul, with 8 others, discovered Locust 4. Locust number 4 led to the interior of Noah's Ark. It went to a variety of loci, including 2 cargo storage facilities with chickpea, pea, and bitter vetch, several small habitations that were associated with furniture that was affixed to the walls, with a prehistoric assemblage from the late Epipaleolithic with bone and wood artifacts, baskets, and stone bowls, principally basalt bowls. This artifact assemblage was very special. It reflected an origin from the Levant, Israel, Palestine, Syria, southern Lebanon, and western Jordan. Very significant. And so with the funds from Noah's Ark Ministries International and TME, and with his knowledge of the mountain that was forged not only by his grandmother but also by his Armenian cousins, Noah's Ark was rediscovered. Now, why is this important? Well, Noah's Ark is very important to science. First, it represents the end of the Stone Age, the greatest height, the apogee of the Stone Age. So you have this late Epipaleolithic barge that is filled with the latest innovations in terms of the domestication of plants, domestication of animals, the precursors to the development of ceramics, namely wood bowls covered with clay and then burned over fire. Eventually, they just dispensed with the wood and burned the clay, but that was later on in the development of this technology. An enormous, monumental 158-meter barge that bears the precursor of many terrestrial structures and certainly the origins of maritime architecture. Even more so, the archaeobotanical remains and the animal remains are preserved so that DNA analysis can be done between all animal species living today and all human populations to see which descendant our populations emerged from that were in Noah's Ark. Also, this site represents the progenitor structure, the origin for the farming age, or what they call the Neolithic, specifically the pre-pottery Neolithic. And lastly, this site provides the efficacy for 3 world religions, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So not only is Noah's Ark important to science, but it's crucially important to faith. And so with this, we have covered the beginning of the Armenian misdirection, from 247 BC with the Mount Cardu ruse. We have talked about how the Ark was concealed by the Catholicos and how the Catholicos became the main entity in the protection and preservation and concealment of Noah's Ark. Then we talked about Crimean Heirig, Papa Crimean, and his efforts as a very influential Catholicos to use Noah's Ark to acquire money for the Catholicos and also for Armenian independence against the Ottoman Turks. Then we covered Crimean's final orders to conceal the site, telling individuals that were descended from the Ark Guide to always misdirect foreigners away from the true location of Noah's Ark in the southern gorge. Then we talked about the absolute tragedy of the Armenian Genocide by the Turks and then the later horrible purge by the Soviet Union, and Lavrenti Beria and Nikolai Yezhov and Joseph Stalin. But with this, the knowledge of Noah's Ark, the location, was known and was preserved by Armenian women from the original Ark guides that were trapped behind Turkish lines during the genocide and during the War of Independence, but married Kurdish men. And this knowledge was preserved, leading finally to several Kurdish individuals and ultimately to the knowledge of Ahmet Ertuğrul, who rediscovered Noah's Ark. Now, what happened to the grandmother? Well, her husband died, and she loved him very much, and she missed him when he died. And think of it, he saved her life. This was not a situation where she was pressed into some sort of sexual slavery. No, this individual not only protected her and married her, but he did so during a time of tremendous upheaval, of terrible starvation. Probably the worst time that you could ever want to marry or select an individual as a wife due to the threat of the Turks and Kurdish militia trying to eliminate Armenian people. And then the tremendous starvation that occurred, both from the genocide and World War I, the Caucasus campaigns with the invasion of the Russians and the Armenians, partly in revenge for the genocide. So this was a terrible time to select a wife, but he did, and he protected her, and he loved her, and he gave her wonderful children and a wonderful family. Now, the end of her life, what she did is she chose to live just inside the border of what is now the Republic of Georgia. And Ahmet and Mehmet took care of her until she passed away. But this was known as the grandmother's house, where she lived with family members, and it was difficult. All these women that survived the Armenian genocide and married Kurdish men, they weren't really accepted by their Kurdish families, and Ahmet's grandmother had to be very careful not to anger any of the other clan members because they would expose her as being a former Armenian. But when she moved to just inside the Republic of Georgia, she wasn't very much accepted because she had converted to Islam and married a Kurdish man. But still, she passed away in a peaceful situation just inside the border of the Republic of Georgia. And Mehmet and Ahmet were very kind to her, and at least she knew one of her grandsons continued the thin line of knowledge of the location of Noah's Ark and acted upon the knowledge, which led to the rediscovery of Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark is just so crucial for science and faith. And now the site is protected, but what's an emergency now is it needs conservationists and archaeologists to conduct preservation of the organic architecture and remains and initiate in-depth research to the site that is so important to faith and science. Thank you.